Mr. Speaker, sir, I rise to second the motion that this House do adopt the report on the Session Committee on the County Public Accounts and Investment on the inquiry into the possible loss of funds through the acquisition of the land for public use. Mr. Speaker, sir, I'd want to limit my remarks on three issues. The first issue is that first, on the onset, before I get into the substantive issues of this report, I would like to thank the Powers and Privileges Committee for having taken their time. This was a very emotive issue that brought a lot of questions in the integrity of this House. Mr. Speaker, sir, I always say that the Senate, and I want to remind all the distinguished senators here, and that's the reason why we are called distinguished senators, that we are a house of reason. We are a house that unites the entire Republic of Kenya. And when we are here, we are tasked with one responsibility. The Constitution is very clear, Mr. Speaker, sir, that our role under Article 96 is to protect the interest of our counties and their governments. Mr. Speaker, sir, this issue of Ruaraka is something which has divided us. And at one point, this House in particular, it would have been difficult to tell who is in the opposition and who is in government. But today, I dare say that by the end of us debating this report, that division will once again be very, very clear.
Order, Senator.
Mr. Speaker, sir.
Order. You cannot anticipate debate. You are out of order, Senator Olekina. Please second the motion. Overruled.
Speaker, sir, I will stand guided. And one of the key most important things, Mr. Speaker, sir, is that, you know, Martin Luther King once said that in the end, we will remember not the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends. Mr. Speaker, sir, the issue here is the issue of a fiducial responsibility. The questions which we were tasked in our committee is to investigate whether the public lost money. That is the task we are given, Mr. Speaker, sir. And that is what we set out to do. And as a member of that committee, I had anticipated that once we conclude our investigation, we'd be able to bring our report into this House, give the members an opportunity to be able to interrogate the report, so that when each member stands here, they can be able to refer to this report. Mr. Speaker, sir, yesterday we were discussing about the issue of compulsory acquisition when we were talking about passing the new law. And that is one of the issues that we focused on and conversed on in the process of acquiring the Ruaraka land. Mr. Speaker, sir, during the time of our inquiry, we invited all the people of interest. We visited other people of interest. And one of the very clear things is that NLC came in here, presented a particular direction. The Minister of Education, the current Minister or Cabinet Secretary of Education, came in and presented a particular direction. The Principal Secretary of the Ministry of Education also came in here and presented a particular direction. So what we are presenting here, Mr. Speaker, sir, before we even say this is what the committee observed and these are the recommendations, is the facts as were presented. There was nothing personal. It is an issue of a fiducial responsibility, Mr. Speaker, sir. When we interviewed the Principal Secretary, Mr. Belio Kipsang, Mr. Speaker, sir, Mr. Kipsang presented the documents that he gave us on the process of acquiring that land for the two schools. And during that time, as mandated to us, Mr. Speaker, sir, we poked holes on the report, on his submissions. And one of the things which was very clear is that initially, Mr. Speaker, sir, the Principal Secretary had set up a committee headed by a gentleman by the name of Ololtua. And that's where I want to begin my submissions in the issue of this transaction. When this task force was established, Mr. Speaker, sir, which was under the ministry, at that point, I would have thought that the ministry would have followed the report for two reasons, Mr. Speaker, sir. First of all, when you establish a task force, you're using public funds for them to go out and investigate and say, is this piece of property, which now there is a claim, does it really belong to the public or is it private land? At that point, Mr. Speaker, sir, the task force led by Ololtua, which is in our report, is some of our observation, number 64. And I hope that we can be able to look into this report. Ololtua clearly found that, and I'm going to read, and I'm going to refer to number 64 of our report, is that the Nairobi Regional Coordinator for Education, Mr. John L. Ololtua, via a letter, reference number CQAS/KAS/8/16, dated 3rd February 2017, which is annexed to this report, wrote to the Principal Secretary, Ministry of Education, Dr. Belio Kipsang, forwarding a copy of the assessment report on quality assurance and standards of the Ruaraka High School. And in one of the recommendations, Mr. Speaker, sir, he made the report that the land on which the school was situated was a surrendered portion of land for public utility. The claimant had no basis for compensation. Mr. Speaker, sir, since we are tasked, and I would have expected my good friend, Dr. Belio Kipsang, because he is the accounting officer, to halt the process there. Because the task force, which he had set up, clearly came up with a finding and recommendation that, no, that is public land. It is not private land. But when we have a situation where you are, as an accounting officer, then there is also pressure from all corners. The next move, according to Dr. Kipsang, is that he wrote to the minister, the cabinet secretary then, who is Dr. Fred Matiang'i, and indicated the findings of the task force, also wrote to Treasury. But where I do not understand what came in between, that the minister ignored, first of all, ignored the report and the recommendation of the task force, and subsequently, according to the letters presented, or the documentation presented by Dr. Belio Kipsang when he appeared before us, the transaction proceeded. Mr. Speaker, sir, when we look at the current Land Act and the process of compulsory acquisition, there is a particular process that ought to be followed. I do not want to deliberate on or to belabor on those annexes, but they're in this report, which are available, and every Kenyan can be able to come to Parliament and get a copy of this report. You'd be able to see that there was a rush in the Ministry of Lands, particularly from the NLC, to ensure that this transaction takes place. Number one, Mr. Speaker, sir, there was no money. The Ministry of Education did not have money to get this land. So, of course, Treasury was involved. I would have thought that before Treasury makes any move forward, the first question, which is done from a business perspective, Mr. Speaker, sir, is to inquire on the instrument of ownership. Carry out proper due diligence to figure out before we purchase. And I'm sure, Mr. Speaker, sir, the distinguished senators here from both sides of the aisle are businessmen. Or they have engaged in a transaction. They have bought a property. Before you proceed and you pay money, which you've worked so hard to be able to earn, you carry out the proper due diligence. And one of the most important things that you must have, Mr. Speaker, sir, are the instruments of ownership. And in this case, it's a title deed. The chair of the committee submitted here, Mr. Speaker, sir, that the process of even the title, the land, the subdivision, when it was subdivided. Mr. Speaker, sir, please protect me from the majority leader. Mr. Speaker, sir, when the chair...
Yes, Senator
I was
Olekina.
asking you to protect me from the majority leader.
What
because
has the majority leader done?
It was disrupting me when I'm giving my presentation. And Mr. Speaker, sir, people are different. I want to concentrate because I believe that Kenyans who pay me a salary ought to know what I did. And I would beg that the majority leader listens. Because I've not pointed...
Order. What is it, Senator Murkomen, leader of majority?
The Speaker, is it in order for Senator Ledama, the Speaker, to insinuate that when he sees me, he loses concentration, Mr. Speaker? Because, Mr. Speaker, I just walked into my seat, and is it in order for him to insinuate, Mr. Speaker, that when he looks at me, he loses concentration? Where will I go, Mr. Speaker, and I'm supposed to be here? He can as well look at elsewhere, Mr. Speaker. He doesn't have to look at me.
Senator Olekina, proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, sir. Mr. Speaker, sir, I can look at the distinguished senator at any given time, and I will not be, I won't get confused. But when he's talking to me and I'm really trying to follow through, then it brings in other issues. Mr. Speaker, sir, to get back into the issues of this transaction, the law provides that during a process of compulsory land acquisition, there are various steps that have got to be taken into consideration. The stakeholders must be involved. And during the submissions of the NLC to our committee, Mr. Speaker, sir, our committee observed that NLC did not follow the full steps in order to ensure that anyone who had a stake in this land could be able to lay their claim. That point was re-emphasized, Mr. Speaker, sir, by the head teacher and the board of management of Ruaraka High School during our visit. When we visited the school, Mr. Speaker, sir, the board and the head teacher, and we're very lucky that we found one person who had been in the board for a very long time. It dates back to when I was a young boy, even when the school was started. And his memory was very clear. He said that we had expected at least, if this land is being claimed to be private land, and we have been here, we know very well that this is public land. The law provides that various notices have got to be published so that we can also lay a claim. That, Mr. Speaker, sir, as per the annexures and documents presented of the Gazette notices, which were presented by NLC, you note that NLC deliberately failed to carry out proper due diligence to ensure that if there was anyone out there who had a claim on this property, they were given an opportunity to lay their claim. Mr. Speaker, sir, on the issue of the instrument of ownership, which my good friend Dr. Bello Kipsang raised a question on, currently, as we sit in this house, no one knows whether the interest of the taxpayers for the 1.5 billion shillings, which has already been paid out to the directors of Hewland and this other company, Afrisom, no one can say that that money has actually been protected. Because during the presentation by Nairobi Governor, he clearly indicated that that piece of land was surrendered to the public. But on that point, Mr. Speaker, sir, no one, not even Treasury, before releasing the money, or before coming, or even Parliament before coming up with a supplementary budget, ensured that before any payment were made, they had at least a title of that land. Mr. Speaker, sir, as we speak right now, and this is why it is important for the distinguished senators here in this House today to divorce themselves entirely from any political interest, and we prosecute this matter squarely based on facts. Nothing stops the directors of Hewland and AfriSom from going into any particular commercial bank, knowing that, Mr. Speaker, sir, and some of the observation was that part of this land, about 35 acres, was sold to the Ministry of Interior, where the GSU houses were built. Noting that the government also bought some land which was reserved for roads. When you look at the Title D, Mr. Speaker, sir, I dare say, even as we speak right now, if it wasn't for the move by the current CS, who I thank so much for lands, to be able to put a caveat on that portion of land, today, if it wasn't for Farida Karunoi, Mr. Speaker, sir, maybe the owners of AfriSom and Hewland Limited would have gone to any commercial bank here, taken that land, the Title D of 96 acres, and gotten a loan. Mr. Speaker, sir, the issues here are very, very sensitive. We are dealing with public money. When we sat down and recommended that Matiang'i, the former Minister of Education, take personal responsibility, is because he had been informed by a task force that is set out to be able to, that piece of land was public land. But he proceeded and went ahead and confirmed the transaction. Mr. Speaker, sir, the other people we met were the Kenya Revenue Authority. And in their submission, Mr. Speaker, sir, the Kenya Revenue Authority clearly stated that the two companies were not registered with KRA. They were not registered with KRA. And as such, they were not tax compliant. So we ask ourselves here, what exactly are we doing? Here we are saying we want to protect public money. Here we are borrowing money left, right, and center. KRA is saying we cannot raise the money. In fact, if the 1.5 billion, before even releasing the 1.5 billion, the first thing that I would have expected to happen is that at least if, hypothetically, if that land was private land, the first thing I would have expected is that the taxman gets his share. But even when the taxman come before us and say that these two companies are not registered with KRA, what exactly are we doing, Mr. Speaker, sir? What stops anyone out there from just going in and getting, friends all over and committing public funds? Mr. Speaker, sir, Kenyans will judge us. And I want to repeat the quote that I started with, that in the end, as Martin Luther King said, we will remember not the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends. The friends we have right now, Mr. Speaker, sir, are those kids in Ruaraka who have lived there, the parents, that community that for many years have believed that this is our land.
Your time is up. You have 1 more minute because you misused your time.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, sir, for
Doing
being
the
gracious.
necessary
Mr.
things.
Speaker, sir,
1
I'm
minute.
concluding, and I'd like to go straight to our recommendation, which I stand by them entirely. And one, Mr. Speaker, sir, I believe that the only way that we can get justice, if the DCI and the ESCC move expeditiously to recover the 1.5 billion and put it back into the public offer. I strongly believe that the chairperson of NLC should take personal responsibility as our recommendation in this. And I also believe, Mr. Speaker, sir, that the then Minister of Education, Mr. Dr. Fred Matiang'i, should also take personal responsibility on this matter, because he ignored the report by the task force that he formed, and only then would we be able to